thing we have to fear is
in war. There is no substitute for victory.
Let us never negotiate out of fear.
We stand undivided, forever united, fighting hand in hand for the liberty we've earned, for glory and honor, for our sons and daughters, ever mindful of the lessons we've learned. Let the torch of freedom burn.
Welcome to the intersection of faith and politics. This is WallBuilders Live with David Barton and Rick Green. Thanks for joining us today. Visit online at wallbuilders.com and wallbuilderslive.com. We're right in the middle, David, or not in the middle. We're at the beginning of presidential season, so it's time for us to start thinking about what to look for in those candidates.
Yeah, and we have to remember that some things are more important than others. Each one of these candidates will have a platform. Some of the media sources have identified over 30 individuals that are looking at running for president. And so as you look at them, they're each going to have their 3, 4, 5 issues. It's going to be somewhat different from the others. So out of 30 candidates, you may come up with 60 or 70 issues that are out there that they raise. And we've got to prioritize those issues because some things are more important than others. Like in basketball, yeah, you may have a college team may have 40 games in a year, but you know what? The game at the Final Four is a whole lot more important than your season opener because at that point, it's win or go home. And it's that way with playoffs in football. Yeah, you got 16 games in a football season for the pros, but when you're in the playoffs, that game is more important than the other 16 you had. So we got to prioritize, and God shows us how to do that. I mean, literally in the Bible, you have 613 laws on how to run a culture and a people, and he boils it down and he says, well, let me give you my top 10. And so in looking at 30-some-odd candidates and saying, man, we're going to hear a lot of stuff, how do we know what's the most important? One of the guys who's had a lot of experience with presidential candidates and presidential campaigns and a lot of spiritual experience and wisdom as well. He has a network of nearly 60,000 pastors that he deals with. Pastor Jim Garlow out of Skyline Church in San Diego, we thought, let's just get the wisdom from Jim. If you look at all these guys, what are you looking for in a candidate? We're going to be hearing lots of ads. We're going to have several $1 billion of ads thrown at us. What should we boil it down to? How do we find out of 613 laws, how do we find the top 10 for presidential candidates? And Jim would be a good guy to give us guidance on that.
Yeah, he's got a lot of great perspective on this, kind of like our show, both biblically and historically. So he's gonna have a lot of great input, I think. Jim Garlow with us when we come back on WallBuilders Live.
This is David Barton with another moment from America's history. Since the Ten Commandments have formed the basis of civil law in the Western world for over 2,000 years, an individual is more likely to find a copy of them in a government building rather than a religious one. Yet amazingly, numerous rulings over recent years now make it unconstitutional to display the commandments in many public arenas. Consider what Founding Father John Adams said about this. He declared, "The moment the idea is admitted into society that property is not as sacred as the laws of God, anarchy and tyranny commence. If 'thou shalt not covet' and 'thou shalt not steal' were not commandments of heaven, they must be made inviolable precepts in every society before it can be civilized or made free." John Adams believed that no society could remain civilized if separated from the Ten Commandments.
For more information on God's hand in American history, contact WallBuilders at 1-800-8-REBUILD.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us here on WallBuilders Live. Our guest today, our good friend, Senior Pastor of Skyline Church in San Diego, Dr. Jim Garlow. Always good to have you, brother.
Good to be on with you, my friend.
Hey, man, thanks for taking a little time. We were, Dave and I were talking recently about, man, here we go into presidential race time again. Lots of folks talking about getting in. A couple people have gotten in. And just wanted to talk a little bit today about, what do you look for in those leaders as Bible believers? What should we be looking for in a candidate that we want to support? So Dr. Jim's the guy we need to get on to talk about this.
Well, I suspect most of your listeners are going to have a pretty similar view and have already thought this through, but I'm just
I'm longing for leadership, bona fide leadership. How badly this nation is starving for leadership. And for a God-fearer, a person who is a God-fearer will make their decisions with a completely different understanding from the person who is a disrespecter of God. And then one who is so passionate about the things of God that they walk in integrity. Leading a nation, and particularly leading the most influential nation in the world right now, there could not be a more challenging, more difficult job than that, more complex job. But as a starter, integrity is so critical. And then if I can push it a little further to the policy components, I'm not a single issue guy, abortion, but where a candidate stands on abortion, everyone knows you can predict with a 95% accuracy or more where they'll stand on everything else.
That's right.
If they will not defend the most defenseless, they'll not honor the Constitution. The pursuit of life is foundational. Show me where he stands on life, and I can pretty well predict where he's going to land on almost everything else. I'm not a dual issue person either, that is abortion and marriage. But show me where a person stands on marriage. This one we don't have the time to go into, but I will show you theologically where he stands on respecting God. If they will stand with traditional, biblical, historical, natural marriage, that is an indicator. And again, it would take me a little time to flush that out theologically, but that will reveal where that person really stands and their respect for God. And the short version of that is just simply this, that if a person acknowledges that Genesis 1, that marriage, covenantal marriage between a man and a woman, is a reflector of the image of God, then one would be committed to protect it. And in Revelation, the book ends with the marriage of a bride and a groom. And the whole imagery there is Jesus in the church. Show me a person who respects marriage, and that's demonstrating that also respects the profound imagery of the consummation or culmination of history. And then if I can drill down deeper, and then I'll be silent, listen to whatever the next question is, somebody who's willing to honor the Constitution. And by that, I would flesh it out even further, someone who's willing to take on the court for its extreme imperialistic ways of ruling, specifically the Supreme Court, which is, in the opinion of so many, in violation, the imbalance of the three branches of government that were established so we would not have a Supreme Court like we now have. That would be what I'm looking for in a president.
Man, these are great. These are great. Let me run through them real quick, and then I'd love to break them down a little further. So a God-fearer, someone that their integrity is just, I mean, it shines through where they stand on life because of the indication that is and so many other things, where they stand on marriage because what that says about whether or not they truly are a God-fearer, that they honor the Constitution, and that they'll take on the court for this imperial judiciary that we're dealing with. Let's start with God-fear. Pastor Jim, this is a culture today where, man, if you mention your faith in God, especially as a political candidate, some people just come unglued, and you definitely will withstand attacks from the left, but even conservatives will say, I wish they wouldn't talk about that. So how do we look for that, and how do we hope that a candidate would articulate that, and how do we defend them when they do?
Well, I think they need to do it winsomely. I'm not suggesting you need to do it arrogantly, but it needs to be done winsomely. Yet at the same time, this goes back to the first issue I said, leadership.
Yeah.
And leaders are, by definition, those who are willing to walk in courage. And that does not mean that they're out to wow people. It does not mean they're out to win everybody's approval. In fact, they're not out to win approval of people at all. Foundationally, they're about pleasing God, and then the approval of humankind follows that. What we do not see is a sense of courageous, bold, principle-driven leadership, as opposed to putting up the finger, seeing which way the wind is blowing, or which way the parade is going, and trying to run and get back in front of that particular parade. We've had way too many, both Democrats and Republicans, lead in that particular way. I don't know if everyone feels this way. Well, obviously not everyone does, but I would think that there is a substantial number of Americans who hunger for the leadership of a man of the caliber of a Winston Churchill, for example.
Yes.
We desperately need that. And he didn't get in that position by waffling. He got in that position by not changing with the winds, and he was thrown out of power for the longest time, and then finally until the people recognized their desperate need for the leadership. And we've had that in our country. We started with George Washington of that caliber, and if we're going to survive it all, we have to have it immediately.
I think you're putting your finger on it exactly, and I think you're right that there are throngs of people in America that are sick of the, like you're saying, just jumping in front of the parade, and they consider that to be leading, and that just hunger for someone that will, with boldness, stand up and say, this is truth, this is what I believe, this is where I stand. And that's true leadership. I think there are some candidates this time around that strike me as having that. So I'm excited there. What about integrity? What's some of the best clues for us to look for in a candidate for that integrity?
A person who will be principle driven and not being permanently focused on the next election. You're not getting a little good report here. You're aware, Rick, that our church, Skyline Church in San Diego, launched weekly worship services in the U.S. Capitol about 8-9 months ago now.
Oh, yeah.
And they had occurred from 1800 to 1870, and they had not occurred for 144 years. And so we have sent somebody out, a pastor out, and he lives there. He leads weekly worship services for members of Congress. Now, it's meager attendance.
Oh, we had him on recently to talk about. Very excited about that occurring.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. And the Hill staffers, they call them Hill staffers, members of staff. And the encouraging thing, I want people to be encouraged. I'm not taking broad swipes at those who run for office who have been elected, because in members of Congress, when you walk through the halls of Congress, I've been out there a lot with our pastor that's out there, and as you get closer to some of the members of Congress, and many of you who work there, Rick, like you do, know this, there are a tremendous number of members of Congress with high integrity. With really high integrity. It's quite encouraging. Now, are they in the positions fully of power? No. In many cases, they're not. And so I don't want the American people to give up and start saying really negative things about every elected official. I oftentimes hear that, they're all thieves and crooks. And no, they're not. These are godly people. Many of them are godly people. But we have veered so severely off course with a president who does not care about the Constitution, and with with Justice Kennedy in his particular role in the Supreme Court, who is creating things out of nothing in the Constitution. And at these two places, we're in a dangerous place in America's history in terms of veering completely off course from a Constitution that is really protected as well. So integrity means that I recognize that I put myself under the oath I take, under the Constitution, not above it. And, of course, as a God-fearer, I put myself under the truth of Scripture, not above it. That would be the evidence of integrity for me.
And really, if you do those two things, if you got a candidate that's doing those two things, then the last four we discussed early on fall into place, because then you recognize truth. You're willing to submit to that truth regardless of what the polls say. Therefore, your position on life, your position on sanctity of marriage, your position of honoring the Constitution and not trying to govern around it or shred it, the proper role of the courts as defined by the Constitution. I mean, all those things fall in line if we can get the first two right: God-fearer and a person of integrity.
Just think of the conversation. Just think of the conversation we're having. We're trying to ask for people to be in charge of the government of the United States who will not believe in ripping up a baby in a womb. Now think of how jolting that is. Somehow we use the word abortion over and over, and with passage of time, the word abortion just loses its sting. This is going in and ripping to shreds a baby. And the whole description of, say, partial birth abortion is so gruesome that none of our listeners will be able to take it. But we're trying to ask for somebody who's a respecter of life in the womb. How far off course we have been? We're actually trying to ask for a president who will respect natural law, let's put aside the Bible. Let's put all that aside. Natural law, a male and a female fit together physiologically, psychologically. They're designed for procreation. We're asking a person to respect what is written on the core of nature. How far off course have we gone? My wife and I were recently at the Vatican at the conference. It was held there last November. 300 people invited there on the complementarity of male and female, man and woman. And of the world's religions represented, 15 world's religions, and all 15, it was 14 or 15, I'm not sure exactly how many, world's religions, all of them took the position that marriage is one man, one woman. This is not just the Bible and Christians. This was every other religious stream on it. That means God's natural revelation was so intense on the entire earth that everybody knows the obvious. And then we just returned 3 weeks ago from Paris, the conference of about 100 or so people, and covering on all 199 nations, what's the status of marriage? And once again, the incredible obvious. How is it possible that we could have veered so off course that marriage, which is defined even in the very design of our bodies, we have to be asking for somebody who gets that. This is how blinding sin is, that it literally blinds the eyes and dulls the mind. How could people who go to Harvard, Yale, and Princeton not get that?
Yeah.
But some of them, many of them, do not. And so that's how far off we have gotten. So your statement is exactly right. If a person starts with the presupposition, I'm not God and you are, and then the second presupposition is that I care less about the accolades of other humans than I fear or reverence God, that will determine their other policy issues.
This is great. Pastor Jim, this is the kind of thing we need to be talking about, thinking about as these candidates come out, as they campaign, as we watch what they say, and most importantly, look at what they do, what they've done, how they voted, whether or not they respect these things. We can't just go into this campaign season with who makes me feel good, who looks good, the trivial things that people tend to decide their vote on. We've got to really look at this thing closely and analyze these candidates and find us a champion that fits what you're describing, that we can take into the election in 2016. I'm praying. I believe God's going to raise somebody up like that. We just got to have the people across the country pay attention and make good choices.
And I would add to that another layer, and this next layer is a secondary to the first layer. That is being savvy about cultural issues. Sometimes we as Christians can be, how do I say this nicely? We're so dumb. I don't know a nice way to say that. You got to be savvy and aware of cultural reality. And by that I mean is Christians will run to and fro certain candidates when there isn't any of the foundational components of reality of that person being elected.
That's right.
And
we've forgotten the wise as serpents part. We just go in blindly and don't even think strategy, or as you're saying, being savvy.
That is exactly right. And then the second component, and these have become, now we're moving to very practical consideration. Does this person have the capacity to perform, to produce a nationwide network, or at least in all the states, initial states? There's a whole lot of states that primaries come very, very quickly, 9 or 10, one after another. Somebody can win in Iowa and get clobbered thereafter. And so they've got to be able to have the capacity, and they've got the capacity to raise dollars. And we as believers, oftentimes when we hear somebody speak, oh man, he'd be a good president. And then the other thing is, just because a person is a good speech giver does not indicate that they can be a good president. Case in point, current one.
Yeah.
And then the next thing that people need to be savvy to, when somebody starts to run for office, who do they surround themselves with?
That's right.
Who do they select to run their campaigns? Because personnel is policy. And if you have all the right values, but you surround yourself with the people who don't, you as a candidate no longer have the right values.
Well, and Pastor Jim, if you go back to Exodus 18, where it describes the kind of leaders we should choose, you've been talking about fearing God and the integrity. Isn't it interesting that it starts with able men such as fear God? What you just described, they have to be able. If somebody gets up and gives a good speech and happens to have the right positions on the issues, that is not enough. Are they capable and able? as you said, of running a national campaign, of competing in all of these states and actually winning the election and therefore being able to go and govern. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because we too often get excited about certain words or positions and don't take that savvy picture that position that you just described. That's huge.
And then they have to have, not only do they have to really have enormous EQ, they really have to have a tremendous ability. You start with the word able men. But they also have to have, and we don't emphasize this strongly enough, they have to have an internal constitution that can take a horrendous beating day after day after day and not change. That's why I referenced the Winston Churchill kind of motif there. They have to have the capacity, because particularly in modern times, given electronic media, 24-hour written news reports and such, and then it's not right versus left any longer, it's right versus wrong. On the wrong side, they will do anything to destroy a human being. They have no problem about spreading complete falsehoods and lies. And so whoever runs has to have a very, very thick skin and emotionally strong. And quite frankly, since most of us as Christians are loving people, we're loving, caring people. And so when we love people, we kind of think they're going to love us back. And we get trapped in this popularity theme that we ought to be popular. And quite frankly, a person who runs for office cannot have that kind of a fundamental constitution, mental predisposition, or he or she would not be able to take this incredible journey. Running for office is grueling, almost beyond what a human can take. Then once you have succeeded, then you've got to have the constitution to take the pressure of being actually in the White House, governing in one of the most complex positions ever created on earth. So I've set the bar pretty high. The good news is somebody's out there, and God has ordained them.
Amen. Amen. Great stuff. Great stuff. Excellent list. I would love it, and I know David would as well, if Pastor Jim, we just get you back every once in a while throughout this season, and continue to talk about these things, dive deeper into a couple of these, and even at some point start looking at candidates that are in the race, and just having a biblical analysis and as you said, a savvy analysis of how that fits into this particular election. Just really, really covet your input and thankful for your time today.
I'm honored to be on with you, my friend.
That was Pastor Jim Garlow. We're back here now with David Barton. David, lots of great input there. Probably do this, many times between now and the election, but we really need to be thinking through an in-depth analysis of these candidates.
Well, I loved his top five. I mean, he starts with the God-fearer, and that is so important. That is, in my opinion, one of the great theological doctrines that has slipped away in the last 20 years in the Christian community. Is we no longer fear God. And the Scripture says the fear of the Lord is a fountain of life to depart from the snares of death. I mean, literally, fearing God and having some fear of His wrath. Paul says, hey, knowing the wrath of God, we persuade men. We don't even talk about the wrath of God anymore. There is a hell, and it exists for a reason. God doesn't put up with wrong behavior. And so John Adams, way back in 1768, said the difference between a politician and a statesman is the fear of God. He said, I can never be a politician because, he said, the duration of future punishment terrifies me. I don't want to get God ticked off at me because I'll pay the price for it. So a God-fearing person will do the right thing whether people like it or not. Daniel is going to pray even if it gets them thrown into the lion's den. 3 Hebrew children are going to not bow down even if it gets them thrown in the fiery furnace. A God-fearing person fears God more than they do others. And so that leads to the second thing, which he said was integrity. And I was thinking about the God aspect because so often it's the God-fearing guys, the guys who really know the love of God, but also the wrath of God, who understand that just like your father, he can get ticked at you and you get disciplined, or he can hug you and love you. Understanding the fear of God is often a great inducement to integrity. Joseph Story, Supreme Court Justice, put there by James Madison, said, to secure integrity, there must be a lofty sense of duty and a deep responsibility to future times as well as to God. And it's hard to have integrity when you leave the God aspect out of it. So I love those two. And then he went to the third one, life. And he says, it's not that I'm just a life only guy, but life is an indicator. And we've talked about that before, how that I can look at someone where they are in life, and with a 90% degree of certainty, I can tell you how they vote on economic issues, how they vote on treaty issues, how they vote on regulatory issues. Life is a great indicator. And then fourth is marriage as an indicator of whether he respects God. Again, does the candidate fear God? Does he says, God says marriage is a lifelong union of a man and a woman. Do you have absolutes? Do you believe there are moral rights and wrongs? And marriage is a good indicator. And then finally, I love what he put in. And the first four, they deal with character. They deal with really God perspective. But the fifth one is honor the Constitution. To take on the court, specifically the Supreme Court. That's what we haven't had. We've had some God-fearing guys in recent years, but they haven't really understood and read the Constitution. And so they've actually caused government to grow. They've caused the intrusiveness to grow. They've caused the debt to grow. And we need someone who's a God-fearing person and has these attributes of God-fearing and life and marriage and integrity. But they also honor and respect the Constitution. They're willing to keep separation of powers. And if that means taking on the Supreme Court, they will. And that's the boldness he talked about. So I really love the five components he came up with. Those are a good prioritization as we look at the 30-some-odd people that are looking at this. Look for a God-fearing person. Look for a person who shows integrity. Look for a person who honors unborn life, who respects marriage, and who knows and honors the Constitution. I mean, that'd be a great leader to have over the nation.
And then, of course, the capable part, being able to...
That's right, the capable.
I mean, that should be a foregone conclusion, but we definitely need to analyze that because you're going to have a lot of people get in that can't do a national race like this.
That's right, and they're not going to be capable on certain issues, and they need to be capable. They need to be able men that fear God. And you're right, that able man is the first thing listed in that qualification, Exodus 18:21.
Thanks for listening today, folks. You've been listening to WallBuilders Live.
We stand undivided forever.